Today, we're going to talk about renting versus buying. Hello and welcome back to our channel. Today, we get into our fifth video about property. Specifically, we're going to look at the endlessly controversial topic of renting versus buying. And related to that, I'm also going to look in some detail at how much you perhaps should spend on putting a roof over your head in an ideal world and based on the record of many decades of history. So as a reminder, so far in this 5-video series, we have looked at the following. First, how important it is to think about real inflation and the real, not just nominal returns on property. And related to that, the difference between money and real wealth and the idea of relative value. We've looked at how to use rental yields to help you work out a real return on a property asset, and at the fact that using mortgage debt really can be a double-edged sword. And in our most recent video, which happily went a little bit viral, so many thanks to all of you for that, we looked at the ratio of property prices to salaries and also at the crucial importance of demographics, particularly in the UK. Please do check out those previous 4 videos if you haven't already. So bringing that all together today, let's get into what this all might mean in the endless debate about renting versus buying. And as we go to do that, first, it is perhaps worth addressing a couple of well-known statements head on. Those are that renting is just throwing money away or paying someone else's mortgage. Is this really true? And the answer is most certainly not always. Throughout this video series, I've already shown how it is entirely possible for you to lose money in property in real terms. That's after inflation. We've also looked at the extent to which ever-rising property prices could well be less likely in the future than they have been in the past for all sorts of structural reasons. As a result, there are actually a good number of reasons why renting can actually be an entirely sensible thing to do. And sometimes it can even be a considerably better idea financially than buying. Earlier in this video series, I used the example of a £500,000 value property being rented out for £24,000 a year. And by the way, just as a quick aside, within reason, all the points I'm making here would apply to a £200,000 property or a £2 million property just as much as to this theoretical £500,000 one. I'm just using that number to keep the maths easy, and also because £500,000 is roughly the cost of an average house in London, which is where I'm from. So let's use that same £500,000 example to look at a few different points around the potential merits of renting. First, let's look at the impact of a house price correction. Imagine that house prices fall 10%, and bear in mind they've fallen a great deal more than 10% in previous crashes for what it's worth, but we'll use only 10% to be conservative. In this scenario, this would mean that the property we're considering is now worth £450,000. And the first thing to point out is that this fall is roughly equivalent to 2 years of rent, with the cost of renting the property at £24,000 a year. This means that you could have been better off renting than buying that property for at least 2 years. And this is particularly the case when you consider that if you'd put down a £50,000 deposit to buy that property, you would have lost all of that money too, on top of all the mortgage payments you would have been making over those last 2 years. So the renter in this scenario is a long way ahead with even just a 10% fall. And the next point to make is that there are lots of other costs involved when you buy a property. First, there is a cost related to that large deposit, which I think too few people think about. And this is the fact that if you've used it to buy a property, this means that you can't have used it to make any other kind of investment. And economists call this an opportunity cost. By putting a big chunk of your money into the property, you've lost the opportunity to put it into another kind of investment which could have made you a better return. And in this example, it very likely would have done, as you've now lost your £50,000 deposit, obviously. This is probably a far more important consideration than all too many people in the UK realise. Over a lifetime, not having exposure to the stock market, for example, could very well reduce the likelihood you will become wealthy. In addition, there are other significant transaction costs when you buy a property, including lawyers, surveyors, and estate agents. And nowadays, an awful lot of people are going to have to pay many thousands of pounds of stamp duty too, of course, with Rachel Reeves having effectively halved the tax-free threshold for most buyers in her recent budget. Then there is the fact that you are likely to have significant setup costs with property, such as buying furniture, large appliances, and so on. And you will also need to be mindful of ongoing maintenance and insurance costs, which can be thousands more too. When you rent, many of these costs are borne by your landlord, not by you. And the next general point is that renting can give you far more flexibility in your life. This could be particularly useful if you're not yet 100% sure where you want to live, for example. In an increasingly mobile world, where you might want to live and work overseas at some point, or at least just in a different part of the UK, it may not be ideal if you end up spending all of those sunk costs required to buy somewhere and then realise you want to move to a new city or even a new country not long afterwards. Of course, you can always rent out a property you own when you do this, but this can be pretty stressful and involve a lot of work and cost, and may not even cover your mortgage in a weak market. Perhaps the most important point to make overall here in this video is that I would argue that people really should not feel that horrible pressure around getting on the property ladder. There can be so much pressure from well-meaning relatives and friends, all too many of whom probably won't have thought as deeply about the whole issue as I'm suggesting you should do in this video series. Far more important, it's to do a proper analysis of what the right answer is for you personally, based on your own individual circumstances, dreams, desires, and plans, and on a much more sophisticated understanding of how to value property than most people have. Buying a property can be a great thing to do, but so can renting, particularly when you are young. And the key thing is to never let the whole subject be a source of stress, anxiety, or worry. There can be huge FOMO or fear of missing out when young people see their friends buying properties and they're not yet able to. And I firmly believe that you will be well served by guarding against that FOMO and by making sure that you make decisions based on what is best for you and, crucially, best for you on a very long-run view. When it comes to making big decisions about property, you should absolutely think in terms of decades rather than just the next few years or months, and don't allow your head to be turned by the siren song of conventional wisdom. As Mark Twain put it rather brilliantly, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. The other thing he said is, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So the key point here is just that it is by no means always better to buy than to rent. And it is really important to run all of the numbers, make sensible assumptions about what the market and interest rates might do in the years ahead, and think quite deeply about what might be best for you rather than what everyone is telling you to do. If you take this approach, you need not be in a hurry or overly stressed about the whole topic, which can be really good for your peace of mind and even your mental health. The other main thing I said we'd look at in this video is at how much you probably should spend on putting a roof over your head, big picture. And perhaps the simplest way to think about what you might spend on property is to use a basic rule of thumb that this should only ever be about 1/3 of what you earn each month, if at all possible, whether you're renting or buying. That might sound a bit crazy, but this idea has been around for a very long time for good reason. Interestingly, in France, there's something called the rule of thirds when people look to get a mortgage and buy a property. In the French market, banks tend to ensure that people's monthly mortgage payments should not exceed 1/3 of their net monthly income after tax. This is obviously pretty different to how many English-speaking markets have behaved, particularly in recent decades, where so many people have chosen to pay a significantly higher percentage of their monthly income than that. In the UK, for example, it's not unusual for a married couple to spend some way more than 1/3 of their combined monthly income on mortgage payments, and often on interest-only mortgage payments too. This feature, this rule of thirds of the French property market, has made it a great deal less volatile than many markets in English-speaking countries. According to the French National Association of Real Estate Agents, French property prices fell around 10% in the global financial crisis, as compared to as much as 30 or even 50% as happened in some parts of the UK and the US. And it's important to think about and note that suffering a 30 or 50% fall in the value of your property at some point in your life can be hugely stressful and very damaging to your ability to become wealthy over time. So hopefully this video series has given you many of the tools you need to think quite deeply about the decisions you make around property and increase the chance that you avoid suffering this sort of outcome. Armed with the various valuation metrics and methods we've considered, you have a better chance of making the right decision about when to buy a home and at what price. Of course, I fully concede that there is an emotional angle to buying a home that should absolutely be taken into account. Property is the only asset where this factor should have an impact on our decision-making process. That said, if you want to maximize your chances of building wealth throughout your lifetime, you should not be afraid to be patient and rent if the metrics and considerations we've looked at in this video series suggest that a property you are looking at is historically expensive. If you find yourself looking for property and the only ones you like are priced at a very high multiple of your income, or even possibly a high multiple of the income of you and your significant other if you're looking together, then you should almost certainly consider renting for the time being. If at all possible, you should look to spend no more than about a third of what you earn on putting a roof over your head. If this means you have to spend a few years living in a slightly less flash place or a less fashionable neighbourhood, so what? When I started out in London, my first flat was in Borough, for example. Similarly, if this means that you need to rent, even for quite a few years, this isn't something you should be ashamed of or something that should be a source of stress or anxiety. Life, and particularly your financial life, is a marathon, not a sprint. And when it comes to money, the tortoise absolutely tends to beat the hare, as I've been explaining throughout this video series. As a general comment, you will be best served by ensuring that you're able to invest in assets other than property as you go through life. This will be very hard if you spend too much on where you live. And if the only investment you have in your life is property, or if you're spending a huge amount of your disposable income on rent, then you're likely to be missing out on lots of other opportunities to grow your money, and your financial situation is likely to be fundamentally imbalanced. Spending roughly the right amount on where you live increases the chance that you'll be able to become wealthy in the medium to long term. This all having been said, for younger members of my YouTube audience, if you're living at home with your parents and you're particularly keen to get your own place, then you might consider spending a little bit more on rent to begin with. If you think there's a good chance your earnings will increase in the years ahead, and you're really keen to enjoy the independence of your own place, then you certainly can perhaps relax the idea of spending no more than a third for a few years, perhaps through your early 20s, for example. Big picture, if you do things properly, in the long term, you'll be able to have a lovely home, spare cash and investments, and the peace of mind that you can afford it all. So that's it for today. In my next few videos, we're going to move on to look at another asset class which I believe it is very important to understand, namely gold. And as ever, if you want to ensure that you're one of the first to see our videos when they're published, please do click the subscribe and bell buttons. And please also think about subscribing to our free email service from the Plain English Finance website. And as I always say, if you'd like to hear from me more regularly, please do feel free to connect with me on any or all of LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter or X. Until next time, I wish you the very best.